Depending on which semester you are taking Biology 102, we do ecology at a different point in time. The reason is we're trying to get our labs in when weather is good. And so in the fall, we do our ecology unit in the beginning so that we can go outside when it's still warm. And then in the spring, we do ecology at the end once it warms up. So that does affect the flow of the class a little bit because sometimes in the spring, I forget that you haven't learned certain ecology topics. And then in the fall, I forget that you haven't learned certain evolution topics. So as we're going through the ecology unit, if I ever reference something that you haven't done in class, please just let me know. It's not intentional. It just has to do with the way the class falls. And when I teach it multiple times, I sometimes forget what I've said what semester. So we will start off with our ecology unit. I like to call this the National Geographic unit because this is all about animals and plants interacting. And so we're going to talk a lot about specific organisms, mostly animals, but we definitely still have plants in there as well. And so we're going to be looking at macroscopic organisms today. So these are going to be a lot of examples that you are more familiar with. You're just generally probably more familiar with this unit than other units that we may have done. So chapter 43 kicks off our ecology unit. We're going to start off talking about species and how groups of species or populations of species interact within their group. We're generally going to focus on just specific populations within a species. We can learn ecology at a lot of different levels. So we're going to start at the population level, and then in the next chapter we'll move up to community level, which means groups of populations interacting. So two different species of organisms in a particular area. And then we'll move up to ecosystem level, which at ecosystem level, we start to get to interactions between communities, so different populations, different species within an area, but then also their interaction with the environment and how the environment affects those organisms. And then after that, we will get into the impacts that humans have on our planet and then what we can do about those impacts and sort of mitigate any negative effects that we are having on the planet and just generally have a healthier planet for those that come after us. So chapter 43, we're going to start by learning about how we study and learn about population. So we're going to learn about population size, population makeup, and we're going to spend a lot of time on population growth because population growth can tell us a lot about the health of a population. Then we'll move into how populations or species interact with one another. And then just very, very briefly related to that, we will talk about pathogens and how those affect the populations that they affect. So the very first thing we need to do is define what we're talking about. So we are talking about population level ecology. So we need to start off by defining a population. And again, this might be repeat for you if we've already done evolution. It might be repeat for you from Biology 101 when we absolutely talked about evolution and populations. So the important thing about a population is that a population is a group of interbreeding individuals. Interbreeding is important because that means they're passing on their genetic information. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it means that the population is continuing. And so we're looking at just that group within a species that is actually interbreeding. It doesn't mean they can't interbreed with other populations. It just means we're looking at one level of a group of organisms. So if they are interbreeding, they are probably occupying that same habitat at the same time. And this makes sense because they need to interact with one another. Now for a population, we can define this at any level we want. We could say we are looking at water lilies in a particular lake, that lake alone or that pond alone. We could expand that into a larger area. So for example, we could look at all the humans in New York City, or we could look at all of the humans in the state of New York, or all of the humans in the United States, all of the humans on the planet. So it just depends on what level we're studying. And so when we're studying population ecology, we really want to define our population. And the study that we're going to do is going to help us define that. So maybe we are just wanting to learn about organisms in a particular lake. And for ecologists doing local studies, the smaller your area, the better you're going to be able to learn about your population. But you do have to keep in mind that small areas are maybe not going to represent a larger population. And so we just keep that in mind. We define our population and then we do our study based on what region we have and the particular group of organisms that we're looking at. So population ecologists are studying the factors that affect a population. And generally, we're looking at the effects of population size because that's going to tell us about the health of the population, that's going to tell us about the resources they're using, that's going to tell us how it's affecting the ecosystem around them. And then along with the size, we're generally going to be looking at how that population is changing. Are their resources changing? Is their size changing? Are the qualities of the population changing? So are they dying younger? Are they having more offspring? Things like that. So you'll learn throughout this unit that we can study ecology at all of these different levels. We're going to try to keep it at population for chapter 43. So one of the ways that we learn about a population is by something called demography. So the demography or the demographics of the population is just the characteristics of a population. They usually do this by taking some sort of survey. We'll talk in our first ecology lab about how we actually estimate population sizes. You can do things like tagging animals, collecting, observing, things like that. So you can collect this demographic information in a variety of different ways. And just like our definition of population, the information that you need about those organisms is going to change depending on what you're studying. But some of the things that we might study when we are looking at the demographics of a population are their birth and death rates, because this is going to talk to us about population growth and population size. We can also look at age distributions. So age distributions are going to affect when organisms are having children. So if these organisms are having their offspring earlier in life, maybe they're having offspring for longer than other populations. We can also look at the number of offspring that they have, the average age that they live to, things like that. And then of course the size of the population is really going to tell us about their resources and how the resources that they need are going to affect other organisms in their population and also other organisms outside of their population, whether that's the same species or other species. Population ecologists often use population density as an indicator of the population because a flat number doesn't necessarily tell you much about the population. So we might say, hey, how many humans are in this area? And you say 7. Well, is that a lot or is that a little? We don't know. It depends on the population. And so very often we're actually looking at population density, which is going to be described as the number of individuals in the population divided by the area that they occupy. So this might be 7 humans per quarter mile or something like that. It might be 150 deer in a 10 hectare property or something. But density is going to tell you per area. And so it's going to give you a little bit more information on the resources that they're using and the area that they're taking up. Demography and density are going to be really important for species management because together they're going to give you basically a snapshot of the population's needs, the population's resources in a particular area at a particular time. And so especially if we're talking about conservation issues or agricultural land use, human land use, things like that, we're really going to want to know what animals we are affecting or what plants we are affecting and how this is affecting their population, because this is going to allow us to learn how those populations are being affected by our activities or how they are not. So, quick problem here. A wildlife research team is studying a colony of emperor penguins in Antarctica. The colony occupies 2.5 square kilometers, and based on a drone survey, there are approximately 12,000 penguins in this area. So I would like you to pause the video, just do a quick calculation for population density here. So we are going to take our 2.5, we are going to take our number of individuals is 1,200, not 2.5, 1,200 penguins per 2.5 square kilometers. So the density of our penguin population is going to be 4,800 penguins per square kilometer. Now we might look at this a year later and look at how the density's changed, or we might compare this to a different population. Another way that we study the demographics of a population is by something called a life table. So a life table is essentially just a collection of data on characteristics of a population. So we start with the number of individuals in a particular age class. So that particular age class is usually called a cohort. And when we are looking at age classes, they're generally going to be kind of broken up into the young ones that are not reproductively active, the adults that are reproductively active, and then the older ones that are no longer reproductively active. And we may not know that last part for a population, but when we're looking at life tables, the number of organisms that are having offspring are really important, because they are the individuals who are contributing to population growth or potentially population decline if they are not breeding very frequently. Because of that, males are not necessarily included in a life table. Sorry guys, this is nothing against you all. The reason that males are not included in the life table is that the number of females is going to affect population growth, because the number of females is going to dictate the maximum or minimum number of offspring that can be produced in a population. So if you have 0 females, your population is not going to grow. Therefore, the number of males don't matter. So you might find life tables with information on males. Generally, they are restricted to females just because they are the ones that are limiting how many individuals the population can grow by. And of course, the female characteristics, age of reproduction, number of offspring, things like that, that they can produce in a litter is going to affect population growth. Plus, you may have one male that is mating with multiple females. And so, again, it's the number of females that's important there. So, for example, we might look at the life table for the North American beaver. So, between 1964 and 1971, Canadian trappers were asked to provide mandibles, which is the lower jaw of any animals that they trapped, and turn them into wildlife managers. And wildlife managers used those to determine characteristics of these beavers. Now, mandibles tell you a lot about an organism because they contain the teeth, so they're going to contain the lower teeth for these beavers. And teeth can tell you about their age. They can tell you a lot about their diet, and they can also tell if the animal is healthy. And so these animals were tracked for a little less than 10 years. And this chart here is an example of beavers in Newfoundland, Canada. So this chart is the life table for the beavers in this study. You can see we've got these age groups here on the left. So this particular chart is broken up into single year increments. You can see population size. So the number that are alive, this would be our N we're going to use N to denote population size very frequently. So whenever we use an equation for ecology and you see N, that's going to indicate the population size. We've also got the number of individuals that are dying in a particular year. This one doesn't very specifically show birth rate, but we can kind of get a little bit of a clue based on the birth rate by the number that are dying, and then also this age-specific fertility. So age-specific fertility is basically the number of average offspring for each age group. So you can see that highest fertility is here roughly between 4 and 7 or 8 years. So this would be where the females are having the most offspring in this population. And you can see, of course, the really young ones are not having any babies. Then we've also got age-specific survivorship. So this is going to tell us essentially how long they're living. So most of these animals are not making it past 12 or 13 years. Most of them are living for 3 or 4 or 5 years and then declining after that. So this can really tell us a lot about the population size. And again, depending on what you are doing with this information, you may or may not need all of this, but this is kind of general information that's going to be important for a population ecologist. So survivorship is really important for understanding populations, and we can look at something called a survivorship curve. Survivorship curve is basically going to tell us the average number of individuals that are surviving at any particular age in a graph form. So for our survivorship curve, we are going to have the age of the individual along the bottom, and then we are going to have the number that are surviving, or the population size, on the left-hand side. So there are 3 different pattern types that we see. Beavers follow a fairly uniform death rate. So what this means is that there's an equal chance of death at all ages. And this will be a little more clear when we look at the comparison to the other 2 options. So we have 3 different types. We'll go through each one of them. Type 1 is a situation where our young individuals tend to survive to old age, and most individuals survive until old age. So humans are a fabulous example of type 1. Humans are really the only sort of true type 1 organisms. There are some other organisms that follow this pattern relatively closely, but humans are kind of the only true type 1. And if you think about it, in general, our survival rate for infants is rather high, and most individuals are living until old age. And that same pattern doesn't happen with all animal types. So type 2 is a fairly uniform death rate. This means that it doesn't matter if you're 1 or 5, there's an equal chance of that beaver dying. So these tend to be animals that are prey species, but we'll talk again about those in a little bit more detail. And then we have type 3, which is sort of the opposite of type 1. This is where the loss of younger organisms is really high. So we see this in organisms that tend to produce a whole bunch of offspring with kind of the air quotes hope that at least a few of them survive. But then once they make it past that juvenile stage, there's a pretty good chance they're going to live to be old and happy. So this is what a generalized curve for each of these looks like. So we've got our type 1 here on the right. We've got our human example. So again, type 1 organisms are going to have a good survival, a good early survival, And then if we look at this left side of the graph, the rate of death seems to increase very quickly once you get old. So your greatest chance of death is going to be at old age. So organisms that exhibit this type of survivalship curve tend to have small numbers of offspring. But when you have small numbers of offspring, you can provide them with a lot of parental care. And so when you have that parental care, you're going to increase the chance of survival of those offspring. So if you think about humans, and I know there are examples of families that are rather large, but if you think of them in the context of the animals that we see on Earth, plants that we see, something like a fish, humans tend to have very small numbers of offspring throughout their lifetime. So if we think of sort of an air quotes normal number of offspring, this might be 2 to 4 in a family. And then if you think about something like a dog, if that dog breeds multiple times, they might have 6 to 10 puppies multiple times over their lifetime. So humans really are providing a lot of parental care. And then, of course, we have medical care and things like that that also affect our early survival. Type 2, this is going to be your equal risk of death throughout life. So again, these are or tend to be animals that are prey species. There's a lot of leeway as to what falls into a type 2. They tend to have more offspring than a type 1. Sorry about that. They tend to have more offspring. They might have limited care. They may have very little care. It just kind of depends on the population. So something like a dog or a wolf, a coyote, those organisms tend to follow towards a type 2 pattern. They're going to give some level of care, not the level of care that some other, say, mammals might have, but they're going to provide at least a little bit of care. And then you can also have sort of the other side where we get towards a little bit less care. Maybe there's care for a very short time, or maybe the eggs are protected or something like that, and then protection wanes. But these survivorship curves are basically a balance between putting some effort and energy into ensuring a number of offspring are going to survive. And it's not that one of these is better than the other. It's just that there are different strategies that have evolved. Type 3 is sort of the extreme opposite of type 1. These guys tend to put their energy into reproduction, not into care. So if you think about humans, we put our energy into caring for our offspring for, say, 18 years, lots of time and energy into ensuring their survival and success, which is part of the reason that we have only a few offspring. But when we get to type 3, these guys are going to provide basically zero parental care. They put all of their energy into making a whole bunch of offspring in the hopes that some of them survive. And so here, rather than energy in raising them, we get energy into the reproduction there. So this tends to be things like insects, maybe fish that might produce hundreds of eggs. We also see a lot of plants doing this. So they'll produce lots of seeds or lots of saplings, things like that, lots of growth, but maybe only a few of them actually ever reach fertile soil and grow into a full-grown adult.